Today I continue the discussion of the American version of a progressive alternative. So I've taken liberties with the plan laid out in the syllabus so that we could begin at this stage of the course by devoting more time to a particular national example, the example of the United States. The spirit in which I engage this American discussion is the spirit of the idea stated that an effective heresy cannot be simply a local heresy, it must be a universalizing heresy. It must, of course, be adopted to each national circumstance, but its content must be analogous to the content of alternatives that would be applicable to a wide range of contemporary societies. In the first class, I addressed first the fiscal basis of the state, and then second, the content of a productivist strategy, a strategy that would raise up the backward periphery of the economy where most Americans remain condemned to some kind of make-work. In the discussion of the fiscal basis, my premise is that no progressive alternative is compatible with the present tax take of the American state. So there is an initial objection to such a discussion in the American context that has to do with the aggregate level of the public revenue. And I discussed the different principles that might guide us in thinking about the relation of this tax take to inequality, as well as to the financing of the activities of the state. In the second part of the discussion last week, I turned then to the great issue of the knowledge economy, today's most advanced practice of production, which, although it is multi-sectoral, that is present in every part of the production system, remains in each part an island, an insular vanguard that excludes the vast majority of workers and of firms. My central contention animating that part of the discussion is that such an insular vanguardism is a driver of both economic stagnation, economic slowdown, and slowdown in the rise of productivity, which is the major component of economic growth, and a driver of economic inequality. The inequality is structural. That is to say, it is rooted in the hierarchical structure of production. And no strategy of equalization can be successful that fails to address the structural problem in its structural foundations. And thus, I described the general lines of an attempt to lift up the vast productive periphery of the economy. Now, before I go on to the next theme in the outline and discussion of this progressive alternative, let me pause to make a few comments. First, this element in the program emphasizes the idea of a productivist approach to economic growth. I mentioned before in previous classes that it's barely an exaggeration to say that the United States has had no strategy of economic growth. By default, its strategy of economic growth has been mass consumption and cheap money. credit, debt, and monetary expansion implemented not by the national government, but by the central bank, the Federal Reserve. That has been the default strategy of economic growth in the United States. And my claim in this argument is that it is insufficient both to reignite economic growth and the rise of productivity and to address the structural causes of inequality. And this is true not just of the United States, but of progressives all over the world. In the last half century or so, their focus has fallen almost entirely on the demand side of the economy. Has been a demand-oriented focus, appealing to mass consumption and to the leverage, the indebtedness that makes mass consumption possible. This leverage has two aspects. It has a domestic aspect and it has an international aspect. The domestic aspect is the expansion of credit and debt of the household sector. And the international aspect has to do with the structural imbalances in the world economy. And most recently, especially the imbalance between the economies that have capital and trade surpluses, notably China, and the economies that have trade and capital deficits, especially the United States. Each of these countries, the United States and China, has used these structural imbalances as a way of escaping the imperative of internal structural transformation. So the export of the Chinese surpluses and the import based on the American deficits has served as an alternative to structural change in both China and the United States. Now, the second comment that I want to make is that this operation that I described in successive institutional stages of lifting up the rear guard through reshaping of the institutional arrangements of the market order is only part of a progressive political economy. In the United States or anywhere else, it may be the most salient part, the most important part, but it is incomplete. And it misses at least two very important themes that I intend to return to in greater detail later on in the course, when I come to discuss, in general, the democratization of the market order outside any particular national context. The second theme is the theme of the relation between labor and capital. So the insular knowledge economy, this new advanced form of production that we have, but that remains confined, quarantined in its islands, in its fringes, is accompanied all over the world by the consignment of an increasing part of the labor force to various forms of unstable or precarious employment, the so-called precariat. And the decline of mass production, industrial mass production, the prior advanced form of production, what preceded the knowledge economy, is accompanied by the sinking, the dissolution of the middle part of the job structure in a large range of contemporary societies. So industrial mass production made it possible to have a stable labor force, assembled in large productive units like factories under the aegis of large corporations. So it wasn't just an economic reality, it was a social and political reality. And it's that reality, it's that social compact that has been threatened and undermined by this transformation in the character of production. And this, of course, has presented a formidable challenge to the labor movement and to the left-leaning political forces in these contemporary societies, because their core historical constituency was the organized labor force headquartered in the capital-intensive sectors of the economy. So it's that reality that has been dissolved. And now we face not simply a very long tail of relatively backward firms, especially small and medium-sized firms, but also the declining large firms of traditional mass production, as in the Rust Belt of the United States. But we also face a vast range of economic agents who have attenuated connections to any business organization. Those are the ones whom I'm calling the precarious workers. And therefore, this operation of lift up has to address both those realities. Not just the backward firms, but also these agents who have lost a stable connection to any particular business organization. And with respect to them, to these agents without such a connection, the aim of the project that I described is to transform them into what I call technologically equipped artisans, to whom we provide the instruments of advanced practice and technology. Now, none of that can be, to my mind, successfully accomplished within the limits of the forms of industrial policy that are generally available to us in the world. Neither the American model of arm's length regulation of business by government, nor the Northeast Asian model of formulation of unitary trade and industrial policy imposed top-down by the bureaucratic apparatus of the state are adequate. We would need a form of uplift that is decentralized, pluralistic, participatory, and experimental, and that works through the mediation of an intermediate level between the government and the firms or the independent economic agents of various kinds of support centers who, instead of pursuing a single unified strategy, pursue a great multiplicity of alternative strategies or experiments. So the immediate reality is this reality of dissolution of the middle part of the job structure and reduction of labor to precarious employment. But looking forward to the future in the relation between labor and capital, we then have another larger ambition, not one that we can deal with immediately in the present, but one that can nevertheless orient the change of direction. And that has to do with the freedom of labor and the way in which we conceive and shape free work in the contemporary world. And here I came to the great theme of the alternative forms of free work. So there have been three main ideas of free work: wage labor, labor that is bought and sold. And the ability to buy and sell labor was what Karl Marx believed to be the single most distinctive trait of the regime that he called capitalism. The second is self-employment, and the third is cooperation, especially cooperation among self-employed or independent workers. As I mentioned in a previous class, the almost universal belief in the 19th century is that wage labor was a defective and transient form of free work, and that in a free society, in a free economy, it should gradually give way to the higher forms of free work, self-employment and cooperation. A very striking statement of this view you can read, for example, in Abraham Lincoln's address to the Wisconsin Agricultural Society, just a few years before the Civil War, in which he states the characteristic 19th century view that no free man who is in possession of his faculties would accept wage labor if he could avoid it. This was the dominant belief. And it was only toward the end of the 19th century that the predominance of wage labor as the characteristic form of free work came to be naturalized. So then the question that I raised, and that we're going to come back to later in our discussion of the democratizing of the market order, is under what conditions we could return to this 19th century idea and render it feasible in the conditions of a contemporary advanced economy. The problem which those liberals and socialists of the 19th century were unable to solve was the problem of reconciling an economy based on self-employment and cooperation with the relentless imperative of economies of scale, the aggregation of resources at scale. Because it seemed that this couldn't be accomplished in such an economy on the basis of the traditional property right. And so any attempt to establish the economic conditions for the recovery of this 19th century ideal depends on a solution to the problem that they left unsolved through innovation in the property regime. That is, the basic terms of decentralized access to the means of production. And I anticipated in an earlier class, just as a thought experiment, an example of the general direction. Not for now, not for the present, but far into the future. And the direction is to imagine that the productive resources of society are vested in certain legal instruments like public trust that are independent of the government, not objects of discretionary allocation by any governmental authority, but that they conduct a kind of running capital auction, and that anyone can use the productive resources of society who is able to assure these public entities, these trusts, of the highest rate of return. Under those conditions, we can at least imagine, in principle, conceptually, the solution to that problem of how the predominance of self-employment and cooperation might be reconciled with the imperatives of imperative of economies of scale. Now, the third theme of a progressive and productivist political economy, which I also intend to come back to, is the relation of finance to the real economy, of finance to production. the same period in which the insular knowledge economy has become the predominant advanced practice of production is characterized by the so-called financialization of the economy. So finance gobbles up, it devours an increasing proportion of profits and of human talent. But it renders less rather than more service to the real economy, to the productive agenda of society. There is a financial hypertrophy that is not accompanied by a financial deepening. That is, a deepening of the connection between finance and the real economy. And I want now just to anticipate some of the themes of that future discussion of finance and the real economy. You could say that under the current arrangements, there are three enigmas that we need to explain. The first enigma is the point of all of that money that's in the banks and the stock markets. Given that under the current arrangements, the production system is largely self-financed, the overwhelming part of the financing of production is generated within the production system itself by the retained and reinvested earnings of private firms. What then is the point of all of that money, which is apparently sterile and doesn't serve the productive agenda of society? That's the first enigma. The second enigma is the following asymmetry. That it seems that finance, by which I mean external finance, that is the financial activities of financial organizations, including ones that are not legally described as financial organizations, so-called shadow banking. All of that activity of external finance seems to be largely indifferent to production, to the real economy in good times, and then becomes destructive in bad times. So you could say that it's effective only for the bad, not for the good. That's the second enigma. The third enigma is that what would seem to be, in principle, the most important social responsibility of finance, which is the funding of the creation of new assets in new ways, and associated with venture capital and the related forms of finance, in fact, represents a minuscule part of the total activity of the capital markets. So the most important thing occupies a tiny part of financial activity. So those three enigmas together define the problem of the relation between finance and the real economy. Now, in orthodox economic thinking, the predominant and in some sense the only approach to an explanation of all such problems is to say that if there is a problem in the allocation of resources by the capital markets, it must be because there is a localized flaw in competition, in financial competition, including asymmetries of information, or a localized flaw in the regulatory response to the localized competitive flaw. But what this way of thinking excludes is that a set of institutional arrangements could either tighten or loosen the relation of finance to the production system, to the real economy. So in other words, what it excludes is the possibility that there might be systemic alternatives. And not just alternatives that have to do with episodic flaws in competition. So my suggestion, anticipated now early in the development and discussion of this argument, is that a progressive political economy today in these contemporary societies must address at least these three themes. It must address the relation of the backward parts of production to the advanced parts. That was the object of the lift-up operation that I explored last week. It must address the relation of labor to capital, beginning in the problem of precarious employment and going forward. And by the way, in that relation, there's much more at stake than just the question of the fundamental nature of free work. A basic issue there is the relation between labor and technology. To what extent can the state influence the evolution of technology to privilege the form of technological evolution that enhances labor over the form that replaces labor? So we wouldn't think of the evolution of technology as being an exogenous natural force, but as something that we can reshape. And what we really want at the end of the day is a world in which no one is condemned to do the work that can be done by a machine. The machine is to do for us what we have learned how to repeat so that we can reserve our time for the not yet repeatable. And then this combination of the machine and the anti-machine is much more powerful than either the machine or the human being alone. And the third theme is the theme of the relation between finance and the real economy, the one I just mentioned. And the underlying principle can be stated in a very simple form. The very simple form is that the best way to make finance less dangerous is to make it more useful. That is, by tightening the connections between finance and the real economy or finance and production. Now that's then just by way of restating and expanding this idea of the productivist project, to which I've just given an American version, an American formulation. Before I go forward to the next theme, let me stop and ask whether someone would like to make a remark or ask questions about this. Yes?
I just am wondering if it would be possible, and maybe this is something that's coming later, so feel free to say so, but I'm wondering if you might be able to just concretize this theory a little bit, like just to walk through an example of what it might look like to have a system.
Now, which part of the theory, or
right.
which part of the...
I mean, I think a couple of parts, but the first one for me is like what it would look like to have a bidding system on a productive economy. And then I think secondarily, if you could talk a little bit more about like what it would look like to have the finance industry more closely connected to it. I mean, I think those are very related, but like what it would take to have the finance industry.
Now, I hesitate to do that right now because I just wanted to give the idea of the broader scope of this project. In addition to the theme of the lift up of the rear guard. But, so for example, the capital auction system it's just a conception, it's an abstract conception. There are any number of ways in which it could be organized. And to an economist it would sound paradoxical because I'm saying the productive resources of society should be auctioned off to whoever can use them most effectively. and assure society of the highest rate of return for those productive resources. Well, an economist might say that that's what an efficient capital market already does. That is, theoretically, an efficient capital market allocates resources to their most productive use. And if it doesn't allocate resources to their most productive use, it must be because there's some particular flaw in competition that explains its failure to do so. So the idea of the running capital auction is already implicit in this economic orthodoxy. The problem is the confusion of the ideal conception with what exists. So they're saying this is what already happens. And if it doesn't happen, it must be because there's a problem in competition that we could fix by regulation, or we could fix by antitrust, or something like that. So there are all sorts of ways in which one could imagine the organization of an actual capital auction. One could take some of the major productive resources of society and vest them in independent public trust. And they could auction off these resources to capital takers who would have them for a certain number of years on the basis of a credential. It would be like a bidding process. And they would have a certain lapse of time in which they could prove themselves or fail to prove themselves. But no one would have these productive resources permanently, in perpetuity, which is one of the characteristics of the traditional unified property right. So that would be a first step in developing the conception. But it's, as I said, it's just a thought experiment. It's not a detailed institutional blueprint of any kind. Now what's another example of a conception which you...
Sorry, I just, on that one, like, can you just give me an example of what productive resource you were talking about? Like, I'm having a hard time understanding, and this is maybe my ignorance, so the rest of the class can shut me up if it's not, if they already understand this completely, but like, what productive resource might I take temporarily
So
to use and
so first of all, capital. I mean, just liquid money, capital. Large pools of capital vested in these public trusts. It could also be combined technologies and actual machines or groups of machines or forms of software. That is, it could be tangible or intangible. So that's what we mean by the production system. So the production system is both physical, it's a set of machines of a productive apparatus, and it's a set of capital which is fueling the operation of this productive apparatus. Both of those things can be auctioned off. They don't have to be someone's property. It's a very simple idea. So we go back to the basic idea here of what is a market? And I said this in an earlier class. So at the most abstract level, the idea of a market has two dimensions. One dimension is the absolute level of economic decentralization. How many economic agents are there that can bargain on their own initiative and for their own account? That's part of what we mean by a market. And the more, the greater the number of economic agents, in principle, the more there's a market. But there's a second dimension to the idea of a market, which is the degree of control that each of those agents has over the resources at his command. Is the control unconditional? Is the control perpetual? Or is it conditional and temporary? Is it fragmentary in some way? Now, In the conventional way of thinking about a market, those two dimensions are seen as going naturally together. So a conventional idea of a market is an order in which there are many economic agents, and each of them has a relatively absolute and perpetual degree of control over the resources at his command. But that's false. It's not true that those two dimensions go together. In fact, there's an obvious tension between them. That one way in which we might think we could extend the degree of absolute decentralization is by qualifying the absoluteness of the control. So we would say more people will have access to productive resources, the capital auction, but they won't have access perpetually or unconditionally. They'll have access while they're able to be giving the largest rate of return for the use of those assets. So is an economic order in which there are more agents, but each of them has less absolute control, more or less of a market? This exposes an ambiguity in the concept of a market. That's the claim. And the thought experiment of the capital auction is simply exposing that. That's the point. Yes.
Doesn't in the thought experiment, the conditions on the control, whether just the length of the lease rather than owning the things and tracking them or anything else, doesn't that run counter to combating the economies of scale problem? So don't you need the control to achieve that economy of scale?
Now, why is that? Why does it run counter? Are you saying that qualifying the absoluteness of the control makes it harder to solve the problem of scale? Why?
Well,
I don't.
Well, if you, depending on the length of the lease or how often these options are recurring, obviously you would need the more certainty, the better from the producer's point of view. Does that not?
No, I don't think so. I think there's another problem. I think that the traditional property right, the unified absolute property right, does have an advantage. The advantage is that it allows an entrepreneur, the owner, the absolute owner, to do something at his own risk that no one else believes in, without having to negotiate consent, and without having any time limit for his gamble with his own life, with his own time. That's why the conservative economist Frank Knight said the historical justification of capitalism is the existence of a class of people who are willing to pay a premium for the privilege of running a risk. So that's the advantage of the absolute property right. And that would be a reason why in any form of a market you might want to preserve this traditional form of property as one of the property rights. But there are many other circumstances in which you might not want that, in which this ability to do something for a single independent entrepreneur to do something that no one else believes in would not be the overriding aim. You might want to facilitate experiments with large amounts of resources through something like this capital auction. That would not be a definitive control of these resources, in which it would be an experiment. Does it work or doesn't it work? What results does it produce? If it produces the results, you get to form is whatever form we give it. And then the question of the practical effects of this or that form is an empirical and experimental question. It's not a question that we should be dogmatic about. That's the kind of argument that's being made. Now, the conventional progressive ideas short-circuit all of that, and their orientation is to demand or to consumption. They have no theory of production. So they abandon the supply side of the economy to the right. And the right then has this dogmatic idea of the market. So they say, the right controls the supply side. All we do is to humanize the consequences through corrective redistribution by tax and transfer. That's the basic problem. And the three themes of a progressive political economy that I cited in this anticipate the outline, the relation of the backward parts of the production system to the advanced parts, the relation of labor to capital, and the relation of demand to production, are all about the supply side. And that's a completely different way of thinking. So, and this is now a big problem for the American progressives, because the American progressives have been obsessed with the example of European social democracy, which abandoned the supply side, abandoned the system of production, and wanted to humanize the market order such as it existed. That's what they take to be their aim. That's why I said that the aim is to be more like Sweden or something. And it's against that I'm arguing in this argument. Now, should I go ahead? All right. So the next theme is the next theme is theme of education. That I want to take up in an American setting. And education, of course, is involved also in this lift-up operation that I described earlier. In fact, the relation of the institutional conditions to the educational conditions is probably the single most crucial connection in the lift-up of the rear guard. Now, just as there is a form of economic dualism or productive dualism in the United States and other contemporary economies, there's also a form of educational dualism. It's like there are two different school systems in the United States. There's the elite private schools and the top tier of public schools. And then there's the mass of the public schools. And the public schools, the lower tier of the public schools, are educating children, the young, for a world that no longer exists or that's vanishing. This world of mass production in which the only educational requirements were a disposition to obedience, discipline, keep unruliness under limits, elementary literacy and numeracy, and physical dexterity, especially hand-eye coordination. There are no advanced cognitive or educational requirements. Now there are with the knowledge economy, and there would be in a deepened and disseminated knowledge economy, a knowledge economy for the many. Now, The major educational ideologist in the United States in the 20th century was John Dewey. And there are many contemporary societies in which educational reform has been viewed as a project of national liberation. And I'm not sure whether Dewey achieved that status in the United States, but he came close to it in some respects. And he is the most influential ideologist of the top tier in this educational dualism. And what did he propose? He proposed an emphasis on analytical problem solving, mastered through cooperative talking through problems in teams, in groups. That was part of what he proposed. And there was a second half to the Deweyan program. The second half was the criticism of established culture, established society, and established institutions, culture. That part the Americans rejected. The second part of the Deweyan program. And they seem to have replaced it by the aim of instilling a particular kind of sociability, a way in which people should connect, and which should animate this talking through, this dialogic, analytical problem solving, which Dewey recommended. And what did they put in its place? I think it seems that what they put in the place of that second half of the Deweyan program was the mastery of a particular style of association judged to be useful or even indispensable to participation in the American professional and business class. And how could one characterize it? So it seems to be a cheerful impersonal friendliness, and an ability to cast a halo of self-effacing charisma over one's fellows in the group, that is, to attract them magnetically, but at the same time to conceal or understate this charisma. I think it's this, this was what's recommended as the appropriate posture. And the object of the elite education is to produce individuals who are able to do that, because they are then the most efficient participants in this professional business class. So the educational part of this program in the United States would involve a concerted attack on this educational dualism, and the rejection of the substitution operation that I've just described, in which the second half of Dewey's program was replaced in the form that I just summarized. Now, let's begin with the as it were, the institutional or practical basis of such a program for the United States. So, the United States is a country which is very big, very unequal, and federal in structure. So the general aim has to be to reconcile the management of the schools by the states and the municipalities, the towns, with national standards of investment in quality. And the general principle should be the quality of the education that a young American receives should not depend on the happenstance of where it is born. So to reconcile local management with national standards, you need three instruments. First, you need a system for measuring what's happening, school by school and student by student. And of course, the problem is that the measurement should be very capacious. So it shouldn't measure just some narrow set of skills or capabilities. Second, there has to be a redistributive mechanism to redistribute resources and even staff from richer parts of the country to poorer parts. Because what's intolerable is that school finance should be dependent just on local or municipal finance. That's incompatible with this principle that the quality of the education should not depend on the happenstance of birth. The third principle is that there has to be within the federation, the federal system, a corrective mechanism. So that if a local school system persistently falls beneath the minimal acceptable level of quality, there should be a way for the different parts of the levels of the federation, the federal government, the states, and the towns, acting through joint bodies to take over that local failing school system temporarily, to assign it to independent administrators, to fix it and return it fixed. By analogy to, say, a failing firm in a Chapter 11 bankruptcy. So it's not a federal intervention, it's a turnaround procedure, so to speak. That also seems to me to be required if one is to imagine this reconciliation of local management with national standards. And that's an example of what I would call cooperative federalism. Now that's just, as it were, the practical background, because now we come to the most important part, which is the method of teaching and learning, the pedagogic paradigm. So and what I'm stating now is, as it were, a corrected version of Dewey's program. So first, the emphasis has to be on the mastery of analytic and synthetic capabilities, rather than of dead information. So the aim is for the mind not to be a mirror of the encyclopedia, but to have these capabilities. Now, second, with respect to the relation between skills and content, these capabilities of the imagination are never acquired in a vacuum of content. They're always acquired by dealing with particular content. But what matters with respect to content is not encyclopedic superficiality and coverage, but selective deepening. And therefore, on this view, the style of education should be project-oriented or thematic. And it should not aim for encyclopedic shallowness. Now, third, in its social setting, education should be cooperative, meaning based on cooperation among students, among teachers, and among schools. And so it should mimic, even at the earliest stages, the cooperative practices of advanced natural science. And now comes the fourth characteristic, which I think is the most difficult to accept, but I regard as fundamental. And the fourth characteristic is that every subject and every method should be taught at least twice. Nothing should be taught once. And if we abandon the requirement of encyclopedic coverage, then there's enough time to teach everything twice. Everything should be taught from contrasting points of view. In other words, education should be dialectical. This is the only way to liberate the mind. So the university culture, the system of thought in the universities has as one of its principles, one of its organizing principles, the forced marriage of method and subject matter. For example, basic physics is taught by an anti-historical method, a structural method. But evolutionary biology is taught by a historical method. Now, why is basic physics taught by an anti-historical method? We learned in the 1920s, after the initial emergence of quantum mechanics and relativity, that the universe has a history. And if the universe has a history, then everything in it must be historical. And we know enough to have reason to believe that the basic constituents of nature described, for example, by the Standard Model of particle physics, once did not exist. And that the laws, constants, and symmetries of nature that hold now in the cooled down, well-differentiated universe once failed to hold. So there's no justification in our knowledge of nature for this forced association of basic physics to an anti-historical method, while we reserve the historical method to evolutionary biology. So now take economics. So what is economics? Economics is not the study of the economy. Economics, as it's now taught, is the study of a method pioneered by the marginalist theoreticians at the end of the 19th century. When this method is applied to subjects that have nothing to do with production and exchange, it's still regarded as economics. And on the other hand, the study of production and exchange by some other method, for example, Max Weber's study of the evolution of the economy, is regarded as not economics. So that's a university system. And what happens in the national curriculums that exist in the world, the United States happens not to have a national curriculum, but most countries in the world do. And the national curriculums in the world are basically infantilizations of this university culture. So they provide to the young an infantile version of these orthodoxies, and in this way they emasculate them and deliver them to the higher stages of education, prepared for a life of intellectual servility. Now, there's no reason for that. So, in a free society, in a democracy, education from the very beginning should immunize the young against such intellectual subservience. And one of the ways to do that is by animating the spirit of education from its earliest stages by this dialectic that I described. And then we begin to form individuals who have a higher sense of agency, who are able to respond to the context, to resist it, to subvert, to rebel. They're stronger, they're better. So on this view, the earliest stages of education can be more profound than the later stages of the present university system. So there you have an outline of the program that I see as the education. Now, this program, by the way, can take two forms. So one form is general education, which is the language that I use to describe the program is suited to general education. But the other form is technical education. So the model of technical education that's most influential in the world is the old German model that trains people for the traditional trades and professions, plumber, electrician, and so forth, and trains them in job-specific and machine-specific skills. For example, how to use the 6 major types of metal cutting lathes. Now, this is irrelevant to the form of the knowledge economy, because now we have numerically controlled machine tools that can be constantly reprogrammed, and the emphasis of technical education has to be on higher order, flexible, practical, and conceptual capabilities. And once technical education is reconceived in that way, it's on a continuum with the kind of general education that I described. It's not inherently different from it. And we don't have to imagine 2 different types of education, general education for the elites and technical education for the workers. We imagine that it's a spectrum, it's a continuum. So that's a summary of the educational element in this progressive alternative. And I do regard it as a project of national liberation, because it involves, it has as its consequence a change in consciousness and the formation over time of a different kind of individual. And it seems to me the American progressives should also have, if not this program, then some such program as part of their project. So who would like to comment then on this? Yes.
So this is not a question for Mark. I find a lot of your points on education very inspiring, but my concern is that we put too much emphasis on restructuring schools that are failing according to some metric, often by a state or national level. Then we'll miss why the schools are failing in the first place. My concern is that schools often fail because there's just an immense amount of oppression, exploitation, and centuries and decades of disenfranchisement of people living in those school districts, as well as a economic system that's basically shifted incentives away from becoming teachers. It's so low paying that teachers have, I believe, the lowest SAT scores for something you need a college degree for that profession. So it seems that you would only need to restructure schools if the schools are failing, but I'm not really sure the restructuring can really do much at all.
So what's the implication then for the revision of the kind of program that I described?
I think we need to focus a lot more on the economic and social well-being of the entire community that we're in, that the education school is in, and also we need to focus more on making it so that teachers are highly respected, very well compensated
Yes.
employees.
Yes, so that's a part that I didn't mention, right? The education of the teachers and the creation of a national career of teachers that makes possible their skilling or re-education along the way is a very important component. And it seems to me clear that an educational program like this cannot be the product of enlightened despots at the center. That is, it can't be that a small number of ideologists and revolutionaries somehow animates this. There has to be a movement. And the movement has to associate hundreds and thousands of teachers and schools in the creation of such a transformation. Now you say there's the underlying economic reality. So, and that just reminds me that this is just a fragment of a program, right? So there's the question of the fiscal basis of the state, there's the lift up of the rear guard. And so how do you avoid thinking of all of this as if it were a system in which you say either everything works or nothing works? And that's not correct. The spirit has to be the spirit of combined and uneven development. So you say, where do you begin? You begin wherever you can begin. And then you proceed on that front until you hit against a limit imposed by the failure to progress on other fronts. And then you turn to some of these other fronts. That's the only way in which I can understand it. So it's a structure in which the elements are reinforcing and limiting of one another, but they're not indivisible. So it's not as if it were some all or nothing thing. And you intervene where you can. And you go as far as you can until you hit against these limits. That's how I'm imagining it. Yes?
Yeah, so I personally grew up in a very traditional religious Jewish education. Half of my education was spent learning Talmud and Torah and the rabbis. The other half of it was more secular. My question is whether those types of education, religious, ethnic, cultural, or focused on identity or language, do those still have a place in this educational vision? Or are they sort of maybe a threat to the...
So I think that's very interesting because let me analogize that to the idea of classical education in the West, where the elites were educated simultaneously in the contemporary European civilization and in the Greco-Roman classics. So that's, as it were, the idea of there's a double vision. So you see with the eyes of a contemporary, but you see also with some other eyes. In this case, the Greco-Roman eyes. And you could say the defect of this idea of classical education was its dogmatic canonical character. Why should there just be one canon? There could be multiple canons. But they would all participate in this character that you would see reality with this double vision. So I think that's good. I think I would interpret that as a development, a complication of the idea of the dialectical character of education. That's where it would fit in this fourth platform of this educational program. Yes.
I'm just kind of curious because, at least from my understanding about American public education, a lot of it, at least the impression that I was under, was influenced by Horace Mann and Captain Beecher and Henry Bernard. And a lot of the justifications I remember reading about for American public education existed under this guise of wanting to create disciplined sort of citizens of the United States. And so I guess my question is just, has American public education ever actually truly been about educating people? And if it has never really existed for the purpose of educating people, is it the right place to start trying to implement reform for the program?
Is it? I didn't get the last part.
Oh, I said if it hasn't ever actually existed for the purposes of educating the public truly, is it the right place to start trying to implement reform for the purposes of the program?
Well, I don't understand. What do you mean? So where else would you start to influence the education of people, except in a program for the schools? I mean, so Dewey was influential in the 20th century, right? And he was especially a leading influence in so-called progressive education, which is the main influence on these elite schools. That's what goes on. They sit around the table, they discuss things. And that's the spirit of this education. And so the question is whether you can intervene in that formation of the mind. So this rests, I think the philosophical assumption is an assumption about the imagination. So the mind has two sides. In one side, the mind is modular and formulaic and is like a machine. But the mind has another side in which it has the ability to recombine everything with everything else, recursive infinity, and to set aside its own assumptions and presuppositions. So it distances itself from the phenomenon. That's the first move. And then it subsumes the phenomenon under a range of possible variations. That double operation of distancing and subsumption is what we call the imagination. And the true object of this form of education is to liberate the imagination. So you could say the relative power of these two sides of the mind, the side that I call the machine and the side that's the imagination, is not determined by any physical characteristic of the brain. It's determined by the organization of culture and of politics. And in this sense, you could say that the history of politics and the history of culture is internal to the history of the mind. So this is an intervention in that fundamental human reality, which is trying to strengthen the side of the imagination. And of course, there's an immediate connection to the other parts of this program. So a deepened and disseminated knowledge economy, a knowledge economy for the many, requires a population that has more of this access to imagination. The same thing, high energy democracy. The reinvention of the structure of society and through politics, it's the same thing. So so it seems to me that an educational program is very weak if the lessons that it tries to teach are not in some sense repeated or enacted in the practical arrangements of society. But if they are, or to the extent that they are, then there is this dialectical connection in which what the school is teaching is in some sense echoed in the world. And it's a movement in that direction that we would want. But it shows once again that the central theme of these transformations is not just equality, it's empowerment. It's the theme with which I began, of we become bigger together. And this is just as the imaginative part of that operation. Yes?
So I guess I'm on board with a lot of what you're saying about public education, but my question is basically about higher education.
Yeah.
Whether or not that there is a separate or modified role that it plays in a truly progressive society.
Yeah.
There sort of, to me, there seem to be two sides, and they're probably more, but two main sides to this question. The first is the question of access. So, for instance, would you be in favor of, a free, universal option to higher education, and what that looks like? So, for instance, is the higher similarly to how it functions now, where individuals study in order to acquire the college qualifications to do different kinds of work? Or and there's sort of a separate question about the liberal arts and its value. Do you believe that, and this is a general question, I'm not phrasing it well, but do you think that that model works? And how do you believe that access
As opposed to what, you mean?
as the current model of higher education, do you believe that it should simply be broadened with more access, or is there institutional reforms to be implemented to the way that higher education functions in the United States currently?
Well, so I answered that question partly in my critical attitude to the orthodoxies of the university culture, like this forced marriage between method and subject matter. So this is the professorial attitude to the established culture, right? And that's what. So I think education has to question that, but there are many ways in which it could question it. I don't think that the opening of access all by itself would change that, because the issue is the content and the method. So, and you know, like, there are all these things like general education, core curriculum, and so forth. The premise is the human mind is an organum. It has these faculties. The faculties are embodied in the disciplines, and the nature of each discipline is demonstrated by the way in which the professor thinks about it or teaches it. And so by a series of moves, you go from the system of knowledge to then the professorial orthodoxy. So that's the problem. And that's what we shouldn't want. It's a question of where is the best chance of subverting that? And my bet is that the best chance of subverting that is much earlier in the education of the young. That is, that was the idea, that you would deliver to the higher stages of education individuals who are in some sense already immunized, inoculated against that kind of subservience. And that this has to happen much earlier in the formation of the mind. Yes.
I wanted to follow up on kind of the first 2 points. Like there was that first thing that you were saying about, like, where do you go first, the education or the community? And to my point, like, I have a strong bias because I come from a very diverse public school system. But to my point, and what I think you were saying is there's something about inequality and inequity being addressed through like having diverse school systems and parental stakeholders across the financial spectrum to support those schools. But then there's also this issue of specialized schools that the second person right in front of me was talking about. And so I kind of am trying to reconcile.
Specialized schools?
So he was talking about a specialized, I think it was Jewish school, right?
Yes.
So it's like at some point, you know, he's getting education in a more secular way, but he's also getting his specialized Jewish education. And so I guess I'm a little bit confused about how you retain the diversity of a school system in that way. Like in the same way that what private schools do essentially is remove a certain segment of typically white elite students from the school system, that disallows for the benefit of those students in a more diverse public school system. And so if you have people who are being pulled out for a specific thing.
Yes, I think there's a genuine difficulty here in organizing a system that recognizes the diversity of excellences, of capabilities, and doesn't impose a single narrow grid on their expression, right? And this goes back to the issue of testing what works. So in the international tests, like the so-called PISA tests, that countries use to measure their comparative performance, the countries that do best are the ones like Finland, that invest very heavily in the individualized, customized education of the bottom quintile of each class. But that's an inadequate test of success, right? Because you're bringing up the bottom quintile, but you're not changing the basic character of the education for everyone. So you have to change the basic character of the education for everyone, but adapted to the variation of the different learning styles and the different capabilities. So you have to have a very inclusive sense of the possible paths of ascent. That's what I would say. I wasn't pretending to deal with all of the complexities of that operation, but I'm simply describing the spirit of the enterprise as a whole. And I think, and I don't believe that an educational program is a replacement for economic transformation, which is the question we were discussing before in a previous exchange here. So if there is an economic dualism, the division between the vanguard and this immense rear guard, there's no educational program that can make up for that. The educational program at best can form individuals who are hostile to that in some way, who subvert it, but it can't replace the economic transformation. So, yes.
Under this proposed system, what would happen to classes that take this kind of form, which at least partly depends on, it seems to be, having that kind of infantilized education coming up before you get to university so that you're familiar enough with concepts in economics and politics and whatever else it is to talk about things using the kind of grammar and vocabulary that you are. What happens to classes like this if the school system is transformed?
So what you mean? What is the particular problem that you're pointing?
Once you get to university environments like this, depend on the fact that people, to a certain extent, are talking with a shared grammar and vocabulary and
Yes.
base, which almost depends on the infantilized version.
But why does it depend on an infantilized version? I don't see that at all. It seems to me that the mastery of analytic and synthetic capabilities, the selective thematic project-oriented orientation, they're all compatible with this. Nothing here depends on the mastery of any particular encyclopedia. In fact, I think there's very little in common between us from a standpoint of information or disciplinary background. We come from different disciplinary backgrounds. And so I don't see any incompatibility. Why? Are you saying that engagement with ideas like these would depend on a shared conventional disciplinary background? Is that the claim?
In part, yes. I think we all do share pretty much identical disciplinary backgrounds because we've all been schooled in the same set of subjects and schooled in a particular kind of vocabulary which you're using, which would require a lot more unpacking. We spend a lot of time discussing things conceptually, which perhaps we've already all internalized through 15 or however many years of education.
Well, I mean, the part of that statement with which I agree is that, as I said in my statement of the second element of the program, the analytic and synthetic capabilities are not acquired in a vacuum of content. So there has to be content. But I don't think the content is encyclopedic. So you develop the capabilities in dealing with subjects in depth. And it is true that as we go along, we develop a common vocabulary. But I don't think that has anything to do with the encyclopedia. And so we don't have to just speculate about this because, for example, if you take an educational system that the contemporary educational systems differ in this dimension. So, for example, the French educational system is encyclopedic still. And there's a canon of classical French writers. Everyone is supposed to know. And the American system is a lot less encyclopedic by comparison. And I don't think that the Americans are, as a result, disadvantaged in their ability to discuss these problems. It's just that they discuss them in a way that is less confined than their French equivalents do. I don't think that's a disadvantage. So I don't see this problem at all. Yes.
I'm just curious to see your thoughts on studying or having specific schools or education systems that are very specific and specialized in what they're teaching students. For example, I mean, I go to MIT where a lot of people tend to focus in very technical subjects, and a lot
Yes.
of people come from very specialized STEM, science, technology, engineering-oriented high schools.
Yes.
Oftentimes those students go to college, pursue very
Yes.
quantitative majors, and then go on to specialize in fields of usually finance or technology, which specifically in the current economy that we have are very high-paying jobs. So I think a lot of people, at least on campus where I'm from, make a lot of comments, and I sort of support a lot of these theories that if you major or you specialize in these particular areas of education, then you are more likely to attain jobs that might be perceived as more or just are generally higher paying, and that might be a path to faster sort of economic, just, you know, fostering more economic equity. If you are somebody who wants to achieve some sort of financial freedom or liberation at some point.
Yes.
Is there an argument to be made for that, you think, in the modern education system, that the idea of specializing, particularly in fields that are considered profitable, might be like one of the ways to sort of address economic inequity?
I don't understand that. I mean, so what's the implication?
That perhaps one of the potential reforms to education might be having schools specialize, particularly. I'm not saying this is necessarily important, but I'm just curious to hear your thoughts on the idea of just having more schools, whether it's high schools or universities, that just kind of specialize in, I guess, more of in particular programs that are geared towards industries that might be part of that sort of vanguard that you were discussing.
Well, but that's the problem. So what's the nature of contemporary technical education? It's not geared to a stereotyped repertory of machines and skills. It requires very general and flexible capabilities. So I think this is a false contrast. I think that the technical education that is practical is not this narrow education. So here we are in a law school. So the elite American law schools do not study the rules. And so what happens in the United States is the students study in law school a certain style of argument and analysis, a rhetorical style. And legal education in the elite American law schools is essentially the mastery of that argumentative and analytical style. Then at the end, they take a bar review course for 3 months and memorize the rules to pass an exam for the practice of the profession. Has almost nothing to do with their legal education. It's a total afterthought. And the Americans believe, not unreasonably, that their so-called impractical style of legal education is in fact much more practical, because the mastery of this analytical and argumentative style is much more relevant to the performance of elite legal roles in their society than would be the memorization of a bunch of rules. That's actually an example of the change in the character of professional and technical education. And in the end, they have to make this concession because to show that they know the rules, but anyone can memorize them. So why spend any time on that at all? That's the theory. Now, yes?
Sorry, this is an unrelated question, so I can go just finish.
Okay, so now there's one more I'm wondering what to do, because my American program is expanding into the general discussion of the course, but so be it. So we've dealt with the fiscal basis of the state, the knowledge economy for the many in the context of a progressive political economy that also would deal with the relation of labor to capital and of finance to the real economy, and now with education. So the next theme, which I briefly addressed in the previous class, is high energy democracy, the change of democratic politics. Now, the general thesis is that all the democracies that exist in the world today are flawed democracies. They are weak democracies. They are low energy democracies, in the sense that they make change depend on crisis. They perpetuate the rule of the living by the dead, and they inhibit the structural transformation of society. And so the basic political alternative that exists in the world is the choice between weak democracies, those are the only democracies, and these vanguardist authoritarian regimes in which there's an elite in power, like the Chinese Communist Party, that claims to represent the general interests of society and cuts the Gordian knot of all the inhibitions on change. But then the national project becomes hostage to their own interests, including, of course, the interests in their perpetuation of power. Now, a high energy democracy, by opposition, would be a democracy that facilitates projects of structural change, overthrows the rule of the living by the dead, and weakens the dependence of change on crisis. So it renders the impulse to transformation endogenous, internal to social life. And on what does this transformation depend? It depends on 3 or 4 sets of institutional innovations. And I'm now just going to describe them in their American form, since we're discussing the American variant of a universalizing progressive alternative. So the first set of institutional innovations has to do with the temperature of politics. By the temperature of politics, I mean the level of political mobilization of the citizenry, or of organized popular engagement in political life. So on what does that depend? it depends on the rules for the financing of political activity. To what extent is it publicly financed, and there are constraints on private finance. It depends on the rules about the access of the political parties and the social movements to the means of mass communication. So, for example, in many countries, television time cannot be bought, but is meted out to the political parties or social movements by some formula as a condition for the maintenance of the revocable licenses under which the media companies do their business. And it depends on the voting rules, the electoral regimes, and some very simple rules like whether the vote is mandatory or voluntary. So in many contemporary democracies, the vote is mandatory. Everyone has to vote. And such a rule in the United States would have drastic effects because only half of the American electorate votes. Now you have to understand what a rule of mandatory voting means. It simply means that if you don't vote, you have to pay a fine. But what's interesting is that no country that ever adopted a rule of mandatory voting has ever subsequently revoked that rule. So the rule of mandatory voting, as it were, gets the citizenry into the habit of voting, and then there's no basis on which to revoke the rule. Under a rule of mandatory voting, abstention, that is, you have to go to the voting booth and abstain or you pay a fine. But abstention has a different meaning than it has if there is no rule of mandatory voting. It's much more eloquent. So that's what I mean by the temperature of politics. Now, so this idea that you can deliberately raise the temperature of politics defies a premise of conservative statecraft and political science. The premise that it defies is that politics must either be cold and institutional or hot and anti or extra institutional. That's why I said in the previous class, at the end of the day, you have to choose between Madison and Mussolini. So the premise that's excluded is that you could have a politics that's both hot and institutional. That is, political institutions differ in the extent to which they raise the temperature. And the assumption is of practical interest because one might think that only a high temperature politics, that is, a politics with a high level of mass mobilization, can be a politics rich in structural content. That's the practical interest. Now, the second set of institutional innovations has to do with the pace of politics. So the aim is to accelerate politics in a high energy politics. So if there's an impasse, the impasse should be broken quickly. So for example, under the American scheme of divided government, Madison's scheme, the impasse is deliberately perpetuated. And the logic of the American constitutional system is to establish a kind of correspondence between the transformative reach of a political project and the severity of the constitutional obstacles that it has to overcome in order to be realized. So, I said before, there are two architectural principles. There's a liberal principle of the fragmentation of power, and there's a conservative principle of the slowing down of politics. And the assumption is that these two principles are inseparable, but they're not inseparable. They're connected by intention and by design, not by necessity. So it's very easy to imagine any number of constitutional arrangements under which you would keep the liberal principle but abolish the conservative one. And I gave an example. The example was either of the two political branches, the executive or the legislature, could unilaterally exercise the constitutional prerogative of calling early elections. But the elections would always be bilateral for both branches, so that the power that exercised the constitutional prerogative would have to pay the political price of running the electoral risk. That's a very limited institutional change, but it has drastic consequences because it reverses the logic of the presidential regime. It transforms it into a motive for the acceleration of politics rather than its slowing down. Now, so you don't have to choose between limiting fragmentation of power and accelerating politics. You can have both. Now comes the third set of innovations. The third set of innovations has to do with the relation between strong initiative by the central government, the national government, and radical devolution. That is the decentralization of power to part of the country. In a federal system, it would be to the states' rights. So the assumption of conservative statecraft and political science is that these are opposites. It's a hydraulic model. Either the center has power or the local has power. But it's not true. It's very easy to imagine a constitutional architecture in which, by the way in which you relate divided powers and concurrent powers, there can be more of both. You can have strong central initiative, but also radical devolution. So the intuitive idea behind the thesis of radical devolution is that as a society proceeds down a certain path, it hedges its bets by allowing parts of itself to create alternative tangible models of the national future. And you can imagine that this could go through two stages. So one stage is a stage of cooperative federalism. Vertical cooperation between the three levels of the federation and horizontal cooperation among states and municipalities. Cooperative federalism is an instrument of experimentation, of democratic experimentalism. And then it could go through a second stage in which you imagine that under certain conditions, parts of the country could apply for rights of very wide divergence from the established solutions. And of course, this is dangerous because it could be used either to disadvantage certain groups or to entrench the privileges of certain groups. So it would have to be vetted politically and judicially to prevent the abuse of this power. But what it does is to deepen this idea of the hedging of the bets. So there's a prejudice that federations are experimental and unitary states are not experimental. Unitary states like France or the United Kingdom. But there's no basis for that prejudice because, at least with respect to the second stage, a unitary state has an advantage over a federation because it doesn't have to live with the premise that all the parts of the country must enjoy simultaneously the same level of divergence. So, England, for example, the United Kingdom can make a deal with Scotland that's different from the deal it makes with Wales. It doesn't have to make the same deal. But it's the same idea as given a more radical form in the unitary state. And then you could add finally a fourth set of innovations, which is that representative democracy, without being replaced by direct and participatory democracy, begins to acquire some of the characteristics of direct and participatory democracy at the local level, through plebiscites and referenda and so forth. Now, my claim is that this contrast between weak and strong democracy, low energy and high energy democracy, is a relative contrast. It's not all or nothing. It's not a system. So you can imagine a general energizing of democracy. And so that it becomes more fertile in its power to initiate structural change, to change itself, its structure, even in the absence of crisis, as the enabling circumstance of transformation. And so there's a relation between the different parts of this program. It's much easier to imagine the lift up of the periphery in the context of a higher energy democracy. And in turn, a deepened and disseminated market economy gives more economic basis for the practices and expectations and capabilities required by a higher energy democracy. And then we discussed last week, remember, the question where you should begin. And I said, it's very clear in this list of institutional innovations that I gave, that what should come last is the hastening of the pace of politics. Because that has to do with the central constitutional architecture, which in the United States is sacrosanct. So then the question is, what should come first? And the general belief of the American progressives is that what should come first is the raising of the temperature of politics. Like the rules about the use of money in politics and so forth. I disagree. And I think that what should come first is the relation between the center and devolution. Because the energizing or reinvention of American federalism has very wide appeal in the country and cuts across ideological divisions. But this is a practical and circumstantial discussion about where to begin.